In 1984, Wes Craven introduced a new horror franchise that would literally be the stuff of nightmares, and in doing so, he gave rise to one of the most iconic movie characters of all time. So, in this episode, I want to know who he is, the impact he's had on popular culture, and what makes him so darn scary, as I ask, who is Freddy Krueger? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. To discuss this, I am joined by a marketing professional, writer and podcaster who has extensively covered 1980s film and popular culture. His papers for the Montreal Monstrum Society Journal and University of Nottingham's A Nightmare on Elm Street at 40 conference this year explored Freddy Krueger's role as the leader of a new pack of 80s slashers, or Brand Boogeymen, and their impact on popular culture. So there really is no one more perfect to have joining me for this discussion. Welcome to the show, Noel Mellor.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to meet you, Liam.
Oh, really good to have you on the podcast. We were just saying before recording this that I love a bit of horror and I love Nightmare on Elm Street. So it makes me so happy that we can finally talk about this on the podcast.
Excellent.
So I guess there'll be some people out there listening to this who maybe aren't as familiar with horror or with Freddy Krueger. So give us a bit of background on the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise and what kind of impact particularly it had at the time it was released.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, it's kind of interesting that it had any impact at the time, really, just because of the timing of it. So it came around in 1984. It landed in 1984, by which point slasher movies had been around for a while and had been sort of deeply explored in the culture in different ways. We had 3 Halloween films at that point, although one of them didn't actually have a slasher in it. We were on to our 4th Friday the 13th movie. We'd obviously had Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I think, creatively speaking, it was kind of felt like slasher movies were a bit spent and they'd kind of done as much as they could. You know, there are even articles about that period, Peter Hutchins being one person who's written quite a bit about 1984 as being this point where horror has reached sort of peak tedium and you know, just constantly the same things being recycled. He also sort of talks about at this point, you know, the question of how slasher movies were misogynist, like how much that was sort of being discussed at the time. So 1984 rolls around and there probably isn't an awful lot riding on the first Elm Street film. So as you kind of mentioned, it was, you know, based on an idea by Wes Craven, who had a little bit of heat on him at that time from, you know, some of the cult movies that he'd been putting out. Last House on the Left, Deadly Blessing, a couple of Hills Have Eyes movies. So he had this idea for, you know, what if there was a serial killer who killed you in your dreams? He approached a number of different people about it, including Disney, famously. So that could have been... I've always sort of wondered what that would have been, but yeah, we will never know. But producer Bob Shea of New Line Cinema said that he'd get behind it. But there was sort of a compromise built into the discussion. Sort of Bob Shea said, look, I'll give you full creative control. You can make the film that you want to make, but I just want you to build in a sort of sequel hook for me. I want this to be a franchise. So yeah, that was where it kind of came from. It was obviously a huge success. It was always intended, as I say, to be a franchise, at least by Bob Shea. I don't think Craven was hugely comfortable with the idea, but he knew that that's what was going to get it made. And it was a massive success. I mean, I don't think they knew just how successful it was going to be perfectly honest. I think that took them by surprise. But yeah, a massive success financially, especially for a small studio at the time like New Line Cinema. It's obviously a lot bigger brand now. But yeah, something that took off very quickly on the back of that culturally.
Obviously, as you say, slashers themselves were maybe sort of coming to a little bit of a natural end because the market had been sort of saturated with franchises like Friday the 13th and Halloween. So I wonder if there was a bit of a kind of Wes Craven effect, because Craven himself was very much a genre filmmaker by that point anyway. And if anyone listening to this has watched Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes, I mean, these are not your sort of typical kind of mass market horror fare. They're gritty, gruesome films.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So do you think that that had an impact, sort of Craven bringing his sort of trademark and name to a franchise?
I mean, it's possible. I think it's very difficult because we tend to look back at the 80s and judge it by our own sort of standards. And I don't know how much of a household name Wes Craven would have been at that time. It's very difficult to know because, film was, and cinema was, and horror cinema, genre cinema was largely just stuff that ended up in cinemas that people would go and see. It wasn't like there were fan forums dedicated to discussing the films of Wes Craven or, podcasts and stuff like that. So horror culture, there would have been fanzines and there would have been people having discussions about horror movies, but it just wasn't the same thing. I think Craven, as I say, did have some heat on the back of that initial run of films that he had, but it probably would have been quite limited. I think what really helped Nightmare on Elm Street and really made it took off is something that I talk about quite a lot in the context of how the film was marketed. It's the core idea of the film itself. It's such a strong concept, and I think back in the 1980s when word of mouth was literally word of mouth and not whatever people were posting on social media, being able to tell people about a film, hey, I saw this film and this was the basic idea of it, was really important. I think that's what really made it took off. It's we all sleep, we all dream, we've all had that feeling of being unable to wake from a nightmare. And so a killer who strikes in your dreams is just such a strong concept that everybody can get behind.
Yeah, and I think the just the whole idea of it's just a dream, that it was really playing on that to bring out some sort of really innate fear in people. And this is an American history podcast, but I don't think that fear is particularly American or even Western. I think it was really tapping into something that felt quite universal.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think Craven has said that the visuals for Freddy were built on an experience he had where he saw somebody in shadows who looked that way. But the idea for the actual film came from a sort of news article that he'd seen. I think it was a guy in Mexico who was sort of suffering from really bad nightmares and then one night didn't wake up. And that sort of idea of, not waking up from a dream or not waking up from a nightmare is something completely global. So yeah, absolutely.
I thought when I was sort of giving this episode a lot of thought, I was thinking, well, it must have been sort of the right place, right time for a franchise like Nightmare on Elm Street. But actually, from what you've said, there was almost a bit sort of fatigue around the slasher genre, and that was probably reflected in the fact that, from what I understand, New Line didn't give Nightmare on Elm Street a huge budget, mainly because they didn't really have much money. But if they knew it was going to be such a commercial success, you would have thought maybe they would have pumped a bit more into it. So why did they take this risk?
It's a good question. I mean, again, I think it comes down to that relationship between Shay and Craven. I think Bob Shay was always a very smart. He's a very smart but very shrewd guy. So he looks at film, from a profit perspective, and he obviously saw something that was worth investing in. Like you say, New Line at the time didn't have an awful lot of money to play with, to put into this. And I think the vast amount, the majority of the budget, which, again, looking at it through today's eyes, you might have thought had gone to Johnny Depp, but it really didn't. The budget most of it was spent on keeping the makeup on Englund's face. So yeah, I mean, I guess, Shay just saw the strength of the concept and was willing to back it because I think he'd seen the success of the Friday the 13th films. These were the Friday the 13th films were going into their fourth film by 84, and the trajectory of profitability for those films was still kind of on the up. So I think he just wanted a slice of that, frankly, and saw this as an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, and of course, horror itself is a very commercially driven genre, but there is a link there between tapping into sort of real fears, because it's that resonance that makes money. So, and I think with a franchise like Nightmare on Elm Street, it's all about Freddy, isn't it? So, let's talk about Freddy Krueger, because what made him different to other horror villains that has sort of helped him to endure this length of time?
Yeah, I think if we compare him directly to Jason and Michael Myers and Leatherface, who were around at the time, I think the biggest difference is obviously he's kind of already been dealt with. He's dead. He's been dealt with. The parents of Elm Street gathered together and stopped this child murderer and killed him. I think what makes him compelling in that is that death hasn't stopped him. It's made him more deadly. It's made him more agile and able to sort of work around killing children an awful lot easier without anyone to bother him. So that's what kind of makes him different to those guys. I think it goes back to that sort of concept. I mean, how do you kill something that only exists in dreams? One of the great problems that slasher movies have is, how do you kill a character, or how do you kill your main villain every time and then bring him back? Freddy kind of doesn't have that problem because he can't really die. It's such an intangible thing for this guy to exist in dreams. But also, how do you stop something? And this is a big part of the franchise. It really kicks in the third film as well. Is how do you stop something as inevitable as sleep? You can't. As the rhyme goes, Freddy's coming for you, and it might not be tonight if you drink enough Diet Coke and coffee, but it'll be tomorrow night. And I think what makes Freddy so much fun and so sort of dangerous is he knows that. He knows he's already won. It's all right. You might be able to dodge the dream tonight, but I'll get you tomorrow. So,
And I think that's why, like, Freddy is such a compelling character, because he has more depth than the likes of like Freddy or Michael Myers, because he's a funny guy. And actually, and maybe part of that is due to Robert Englund, the actor who played him. But I feel like when you're watching Freddy, it's so easy to forget that he's a bad guy. Like, he was killed for a reason.
yeah.
But he's got quite a charm about him, hasn't he?
Yeah, that's it. And I think, it is easy to forget that, and it's what makes him fun, and it's what makes him dangerous at the same time. That idea, he knows that you'll have to sleep sometime. He knows you can't stop him because he's already dead. But I think that sort of allows him to be an extra level of malevolent almost. It allows him to, I think I've heard people say this before, but he sort of chooses to play with his food a little bit. Unlike, unlike Jason and Michael, when they kill, they do it silently and coldly, and they're hidden behind a mask, and everything's very quick and violent. And Freddy's not going to do that. He's gonna, he's when he kills, even in the first film, he's doing it with a smile, and very often he's doing it with a laugh. And then as the films go on, he gets more creative and starts to make the kills a lot more personal and a lot more tied into the individual fears and problems of the children he's going after. And yes, that makes him more terrifying, but to us, the audience, who end up sort of almost being on his side in many regards, it just means we can have more fun with the kills as well, and that's what slasher movies are all about.
Exactly. And I think that it kind of mitigates this problem in slasher films of having entertaining enough kills that it keeps you as a viewer hooked, but without kind of crossing that line into just pure like farce. Nightmare on Elm Street doesn't really have that problem because everything takes place in a dream. So there are no limits to what could be plausible in that world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it allows Freddy a sort of, again, it's that word agility or sort of malleability, that he can sort of play around in culture a little bit. It makes sense that we can see him in our world. It makes sense that he's, in the toy aisles or wherever. He can be anywhere. Again, unlike a lot of his peers.
I've always argued the fact that the best horrors are those that leave the most to the imagination of the viewer. And the great thing about this concept is, okay, maybe it doesn't quite do that in the films, but it's sort of sowing those seeds with viewers of, don't fall asleep, because your worst fears, your worst anxieties will be exploited by Freddy in your dreams. And it's sort of, I think it's really preying on that fear, not so much when you're watching the film, but once you leave, right?
Yeah. And I think that's, the strength of any good slasher movie or horror movie generally is the relationship that it has with the audience, and obviously the way it can tap into your individual fears. But the thing that makes Nightmare on Elm Street such a fascinating case study for me, looking at it from the sort of brand perspective and the marketing perspective and stuff like that, is when I'm talking to students about how brands behave, I talk a lot about brands need to listen to their audiences and reflect back what the audience expects of them. And that's what really gave A Nightmare on Elm Street its strength, was New Line Cinema leaned into what people liked for the sequels. They knew what it was that people enjoyed about the first film. They did it a little bit more. New Line did what all good marketers do. It listened to the audience, and it delivered what they expect. So as audiences wanted Freddy to become more of an anti-hero, they gave him space to do that. There's more quips, the kills get more personalized, as I say, and they did that because they knew that that's what people were responding to. And I think that ultimately becomes the strength of the series. But maybe further down the line, when people have decided they don't want Freddy to be that anymore, it sort of becomes its downfall, because you kind of can't go back from where Freddy ends up. You can't suddenly say, okay, now he's going to be mean again.
That's it. And I wonder if, like with any franchise, I guess it does get to a point of exhaustion where, you sort of lose sight a little bit of that initial character. Because I think you're right, characterizing Freddy as an anti-hero is sort of spot on, and exemplified in films like Freddy versus Jason, because in that film, that's, and tell me if you disagree, but I think that's part of the Nightmare on Elm Street canon more than the Friday the 13th canon. And you're rooting for Freddy in that film.
Yeah.
So he becomes the hero trying to defeat Jason.
Yeah, and it's funny because that film was kind of inevitable. It was teased at the end of, I can't remember which which Friday the 13th film it was now, but there's a tease at the end of it where you see Jason's mask sort of pulled under the ground by Freddy's glove, and that was actually years before this film got made. Freddy vs. Jason got made, so it was always coming. It was always inevitable, and I think, although it was an insane concept to see on film at that time, two of these titans of a genre from different areas sort of coming together in a film. By today's standards, that kind of thing would be expected. I think at the time, comic book readers of the 1980s and 1990s would have recognized that kind of thing, that inevitability. I think team-ups and crossovers, that kind of thing, were everywhere in 1980s and 1990s comics. So, you'd have Terminator versus Alien, and Alien versus Predator, and Predator versus Ash, and all that kind of thing, as well as sort of, Batman versus Spider-Man, all that kind of, that kind of thing was normal in comic books. But seeing it on film was quite a big thing at the time. And I think what's probably more surprising is we've not seen it more since then. I think there were vague plans to do a Freddy versus Jason versus Ash from the Equal Dead, a sort of sequel that would bring him in as well.
Yeah.
And then ultimately they just did that as a comic book, but I think there were plans to sort of do that as a film as well. But yeah, I mean, by today's standards, looking at what Marvel's done and looking at what Universal's tried to do and other sort of, it feels inevitable that if Freddy and Jason and his peers were more prominent in the culture at the moment, I think there would almost certainly be a universe of those films. I mean, there may still well be, that may still happen. But the other thing is, I think Freddy's existence outside of reality as well kind of allows for it, and it sort of allows him to almost be the one who does the movement from, be the hero almost, move from universe to universe. He exists in a non-reality, so it makes sense for him to do that. And I think it throws up some some nice concepts as well. I mean, does Michael Myers dream? Does Leatherface dream? And if so, what does that look like? and what happens if Freddy enters those nightmares and takes on those characters in their own spaces and stuff like that? It goes back to that thing of, the dream reality having this sort of limitless potential. So you would have thought that something like that would have happened by now. I know there's legal reasons why it probably hasn't, but
I mean, that's a great concept, and if that now happens, I'll be invoicing New
yeah, if
Line
anyone's
for,
listening, that was my idea.
yeah, but you're right though. Like Freddy actually has the freedom to crop up in pretty much any franchise or film that producers care to use him in, and I think it makes it so easy for the character of Freddy Krueger to sort of saturate popular culture, but also with that comes a risk that he's used so much and commercialized to such an extent that he no longer is scary,
Yeah.
and that's counterintuitive because then the appeal of Freddy Krueger goes right.
Yeah. It's for I think a lot of people blame the films for that, and for sort of Freddy becoming less scary. And I know Wes Craven has been very open about he didn't like the direction that the films went, and Freddy became sillier and stuff like that. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think people focus on the films a little bit too much there. He does become more of an anti-hero as the films go on, but I think the sort of saturation, if you like, of Freddy sort of happens outside the films, and I think what was happening outside the films was kind of more responsible for that saturation, really. I mean, shortly after the second film, New Line Cinema was starting to noticeably realise that there was a lot of money in merchandising and licensing that was being just left on the table. Again, Bob Shaye is not a guy who likes to leave money on the table, so they started with photo shoots of Freddy sort of in different poses and stuff like that they could sell as posters, and then there were t-shirts, and I think the marketing manager for New Line at the time said that they started to treat Freddy like a rock star and market him like he was a rock band. So you get posters, you get pin badges, obviously there's hats, jumpers, plastic toy gloves, model kits, board games. The merchandise really ramps up there. So if you think about it, that's the stuff that's going out there into the world and landing in people's homes and making Freddy a sort of a household name. He then starts spilling out of the films onto TV, because you've got there's the Freddy telephone hotline where you can sort of phone up Freddy and have him sort of abuse you for 30 seconds for a small fortune. So that's being advertised on TV. Then in 1988, the Freddy's Nightmares TV series comes along. So by this point, and quite literally with the TV series, Freddy is invited into people's homes. He's breaking the fourth wall. He's speaking directly to them. He's conversing with the audience directly. And, because of the nature of the show, it's all about people who get their comeuppance and stuff like that. Because of the nature of the show, it's almost like Freddy is making the viewers complicit in the killing. So, Freddy joining the audience and being such a prominent part of the culture is less about the films for me. It's more about the supporting materials around the films that sort of really do that. I mean, it doesn't take long at that point for Freddy to just become that household name. He's been name dropped in game shows and in sitcoms. Even Ronald Reagan is referring to sort of historical democratic policy as being a nightmare on Elm Street and stuff like that. So it's in the culture at that point, and yes, the films have a big hand in that, but you can't help thinking that maybe the board games and stuff like that were just knocking around people's houses just make him seem a little bit less of a worry.
Historically though, it's a real testament to just how powerful a good horror concept can be, and indeed credit is due here to Robert Englund, because were it not for his particular characterization of Freddy and how he brought him to life, maybe he wouldn't have resonated as much as he did. And I mean, I feel like now people talk about Freddy Krueger in the same way that they talk about real live historical figures. He's just become part of the national psyche, hasn't he?
Absolutely, I'm surprised. I'm surprised Trump didn't wheel him out as an example of a great guy, judging the way the way things were going at one point. He is. He's. It's kind of difficult to say what his current sort of status is, because he hasn't been around much since 2010. The remake, the 2010 remake, wasn't received very well, but it was a hit. So I think it made $115 million globally. So it suggests that there is still a market for Freddy, and people still know who he is and are still interested to see what he does. I think maybe a better barometer of his sort of cultural status is the 2018 episode of The Goldbergs, which was called Mr. Knifey Hands, and it had Robert Englund back in the makeup for what he claims is the very last time. And that show was very well reviewed. If anybody can remember, being online in 2018 around that time, it was everywhere. It was popping up on socials a lot, and it was a ratings hit. So it's obvious that Freddy Krueger is still a known quantity and something that people will probably want to see again. But it kind of goes back again to that. It goes back again to the Robert Englund question. He's 77 years old now. It's clear that it's not going to be him. What do you do from there? I mean, it's what we're saying about the strength of Freddy Krueger as a brand is also his weakness. He was a product of his time, and he played right into the culture. He came along when home video was emerging and becoming just a part of our culture, so that he benefited from that as well, or they benefited from that. New Line was able to listen to audiences and allow Freddy to be what he wanted to be, but I don't know how you do that again. It's a difficult thing to recreate.
You mentioned the episode of the Goldbergs. Maybe we're not celebrating Robert Englund as much as we should here, because Freddy Krueger, sure, he's become just an iconic character, but clearly when they tried to reincarnate Freddy with a different actor in Jackie Earle Haley, something didn't quite hit. And you could argue there was many reasons. That anyone who's seen that 2010 remake would probably agree it was a much darker film than the previous franchise. But when Robert Englund then reprises his role in a TV episode of The Goldbergs, it's a huge hit. Yeah. So is it Robert Englund?
I think it's, I mean, I don't think it can be understated how much he brought to that character. He is that character. Jack Shoulder, the director of Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, at the time of making that film, said, to New Line Cinema, it's pretty obvious that Freddy is the franchise here. Bob Shea was, it's not the first time that they tried to replace Freddy in 2010. They tried to do it in when they were making Freddy's Revenge. Bob Shea basically said, well, why do I need to pay this guy Robert Englund so much money when I can just stick somebody else in the makeup? And they did screen tests, and the guy who replaced Freddy was very, he was doing it in a very sort of, he did it like a sort of Jason performance, very sort of, not very loose and performative, a lot more sort of, and so, they tried to replace Robert Englund then. It didn't work. They then decided to pay him what he was worth, and he's been there ever since. Jack Shoulder thinks Freddy was the franchise. I'd go one step further. I think Robert Englund is the franchise. He certainly has been up until this point. He's still out there, keeping the brand alive. He is very happy to turn up at conventions all the time and, pretend to cut people's throat open in a selfie. And he's appearing everywhere, and people always ask him about, and he never seems tired of talking about it. But I mean, like I say, he's 77 years old. He won't be back, but it's going to take someone very special and very specific to replace him. It won't surprise you to know I don't like the 2010 remake. I don't know many Nightmare on Elm Street fans that do. But I don't blame Jackie Earle Haley for that, to be honest with you. I think he's possibly the least guilty party there. I think the remake was an attempt to once again sort of listen to audiences and go, all right, what do you need Freddy to be now? And the general sense was, well, we don't like Freddy because he's not scary anymore. And I think they kind of made him too scary. they sort of leaned into a forgotten part of his character that was maybe a bit too real. And I think tonally, that's where they went wrong. I mean, visually, they wanted to make a Nightmare on Elm Street in the same sort of aesthetic of 2010 sort of Platinum Dunes movies and stuff like that. That makes sense, I guess. But what we know from looking at the remake and what we know from looking at the Goldbergs episode is people want Freddy to be scary in the way that, you know, in a boogeyman kind of way. We want to be scared of Freddy, but we also want to like him.
Yeah.
And the 2010 remake made some choices that made him very explicitly dislikable. So we didn't want to see him again. We don't want to see that guy anymore because that's a thing that we're not comfortable with.
And do you think, though, that's the key to a horror villain that does endure in wider popular culture? Because I immediately think of comparisons to Tobin Bell and Jigsaw.
Yeah.
You know, he's also quite a tragic character and very dislikable and quite scary, but he also has a vulnerability there, and he has a depth to his character that creates an appeal that maybe, you know, these other villains like Michael Myers and Jason lack. And that's perhaps why characters like Jigsaw and particularly Freddy Krueger are able to break out of their franchise and become figures across pop culture.
I think so. You know, you gotta, you know, if you think about the best Batman villains and the best Spider-Man villains, they all have a reason for being who they are, and that's kind of what we want to see. With Freddy, it was, you know, it wasn't. They obviously the sort of initial idea that Freddy would be a child molester was something that was only ever really existed in an early draft of Wes Craven's scripts. There were some quite high profile cases in LA at the time around sort of schools where accusations of things were going on, and so the decision was taken very early on, okay, we're not going down that route. So this idea that Freddy was a child molester, it's never really existed in the films, so we never needed to address it. We could have fun with Freddy and not feel the guilt of supporting someone who's a child molester. I think that the decision that the 2010 film took, in a way, for a while in that film, it's sort of suggesting that maybe the parents got it wrong and they killed someone who was innocent. I quite like that as an idea. I quite like the idea that maybe the parents, you know, maybe that's, again, I'm giving away my best ideas here, maybe, but like, maybe if, you know, in the era of social media, where it's very easy for people to get cancelled in the real world, the idea that somebody could be accused of something and then these parents could do something horrible and that would motivate him to come back and kill their children, that's an interesting idea. Unfortunately, I remember it very vividly watching the film for the first time, the remake, and just, they don't do that. They sort of go, oh no, he was a child molester, and then you suddenly, well, I don't like him then, you know, so...
You're right. It takes the fun out of Freddy.
It does. That's it. And that's what the Goldbergs episode didn't do. You know, they got the old Freddy back because that's what people wanted. I can't imagine there was ever a discussion on the table that they would get Jackie Earle Haley. So, you know, they brought him back and they made it fun. And it was about, you know, it was about the boogeyman, not the, you know, the evil child molester.
Yeah. And so what does the franchise do from here, and what happens to Freddy Krueger? I mean, it's this conundrum with anyone who's sort of rise to fame, fictional or not, is built on fear. That when that starts to go a bit, do they just die off? You know, is Freddy just going to be one of those characters from late 20th century American pop culture that we remember in history, or can he come back?
It's really difficult to say, because on the one hand, you know, you sort of look at the bankability of it, and you look at the strength of the idea, and you go, you know, he can't be gone. Like you know, if somebody owns, well, we know that the rights to the franchise have passed back over to Wes Craven's estate, and apparently conversations have been happening for a very long time with HBO and Blumhouse and other sort of people about what to do with it. So I think it's inevitable that he comes back. I really, really do, just because Hollywood, again, like Bob Shade, they don't leave money on the table. So he will be back. As I say, England is 77 years old. It's not going to be him. So what comes next is going to be interesting. I'm a movie guy more than I am a TV series guy. So unusually for me, I would say I think maybe a TV series might be a better option. I think a movie now, a horror movie now, would have a lot of pressure on it, and because people would be expecting it to be a franchise, and put one foot wrong like they did with the remake, and that all goes out the window, and suddenly the franchise is dead for another 10 years. A TV series, and I know that there's been discussions of maybe HBO doing something. A TV series might allow us to get to know Freddy again, and get to, have the space to allow him to become part of the fabric of culture in a different way. People are comfortable with episodic TV again, being quite a high profile thing, and I feel like, and again, this is not normally the kind of thing I'd say. I'd be like, please don't make a series, make a movie. But I just feel like in this case, a TV series might be that soft reintroduction to the character that we need. Who they get to play it is going to be a real tough one. But I think whatever they do, it has to be fun, because that mean version of Freddy, I don't know that anybody's rooting to see that again.
Yeah, I agree completely with you. And anyone that thinks that they should go back to a movie, I would urge to watch the TV series of Scream that they did around about sort of 5 to 10 years ago now, which was actually a really solid adaptation of the franchise. And I think they could do something very similar with Nightmare on Elm Street. But yeah. Anyway.
Well, I've been told as well the Exorcist TV series apparently is great. There is precedent for this stuff. I wouldn't say the Nightmare on Elm Street TV series is a great example of translating movies to the screen, but it is possible, and yeah, I'd like to see it.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for just being able to watch something scary on your sofa, at night. Maybe that's the way now that people wanna watch scary stuff, which is maybe why there's a bit of a transition to series over films. But right, that about wraps up the conversation for this episode. Noel, thank you so much for joining me for this.
Thank you.
No idea how long I've been sort of hoping to do an episode on Freddy Krueger, and I'm gonna search endlessly for excuses to get you back on so we can chat more about this.
Yeah.
We're going to leave some useful links in the show notes as well.
Yep.
So if you are listening to this and want to find out more, you can check out all of that. But no, if anyone wants to connect with you directly, where can they do that?
So I'm a little bit off social media these days, but if you head to noelmellor.com, there will be all my old sort of 80s pop culture podcasts and links to everything that I'm up to there. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, then there's links on there as well. So yeah, noelmellor.com.
Awesome. And you can find me on X, just about hanging in there. But I'm now on Blue Sky, on LinkedIn. Just search for my name and you will find me. And if you enjoy this podcast, do just take 10 seconds out of your day to leave a rating and a review. And follow the podcast as well so that all future episodes appear in your feed. Also, if you follow the links in the show notes, if you really love what we do, you can support the show from as little as $1 simple dollar. And that really helps us keep making it and makes everyone involved very happy indeed. We're going to record a bonus episode straight after this as well. So if you are a subscriber, you get access to that at the same time that you can listen to this episode without having to wait. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.